Here.
Mr. Butita,
Here.
Fred Westcott. I don't see Fred on. Dorothy Red,
Present.
and it looks like we do have a quorum. Item on the agenda is, oh, and Ms. Gorel.
How about that? I'm here too.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. We have one item on the agenda, and that's to extend the police contract, the Winnebago County Sheriff's police contract with the Village of McChesney Park. Can I get a motion to extend? Got Mr. Fellers and a second by Mr. Arena. As far as discussion, I was a little confused because I had heard that contract has been agreed to, financial's been agreed to, but I think I'd like to have inquire with Mr. Chapman to give us an update on where that's at right now. Mr. Chapman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe we met last week with representatives from McChesney Park Sheriff's Department, State's Attorney's Office, and I think we came to an agreement pretty much on the document itself. This week we met with their finance people and determined what the rates would be, what the dollar amounts and that. I believe Mr. Kalinkas sent a document over to Mr. Green, Attorney Green today. So I would suspect that we would be able to get this done by the end of the month, by the end of July. So.
Okay, so that's why the extension, we still need to extend it until we can get that document signed off then.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Is there any other discussion on this? Mr. Arena?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that there's a typo in the resolution. In the paragraph before the last one, in the last sentence, it says to provide policing services to June 30, 2020. Shouldn't that be July 31st, 2020?
Oh. Yes, it should be. Mr. Chapman?
Yes, it should be. I guess we just need to amend it to July 31st.
So moved.
I got a motion by Mr. Fellers to amend the resolution to extend it to July 30th of 2020. A second?
I'll second.
Ms. Gorel, second. All those in favor to amend the resolution to July 30th, 2020, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. So we'll move back to the so that'll amend that we don't need to vote on the extension then, correct?
We need to vote in the main motion now, which is the resolution.
Right, the resolution. Right, that was, we've got a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion to extend passes. And I believe that's all I have.
Motion to adjourn.
I've got a motion to adjourn by Mr. Fellers, a second by
Second.
Mr. Chapman. I see Mr. Chapman real quick.
Yeah, just one item. We have some information that we have to present to the committee for next week. So we'll need to come up with a date. I believe we're going to meet in room 303. So I don't know if Wednesday night would be a good night or not, but we have some resolutions and so on that need to come to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman.
I think we have an ad hoc meeting that night, do we not, Paul? Oh, I'm in June. Oh, that's
I've not
right.
scheduled one at this point in time. We could schedule the ad hoc for Tuesday, I suppose.
Or we could have public safety on Thursday. also. But
It's up to you. I mean, we have we're probably gonna end up with a finance meeting too, so we don't want to end up with too many board members in the
No.
room, so.
right,
Now, that would be July 1st, am I correct?
Yes,
And I have a meeting already that night with the Health Department Board.
Yeah, and if we're not doing it on Zoom, I won't be available either.
so,
I won't, if we're gonna do in person next week, I won't be available for any of the committee meetings. If we stick to Zoom, I can dial in from anywhere.
okay. We could even do Tuesday night.
That looks good for me.
Okay. Mr. Rena,
How about-
Mr. Nikita, look good? Tuesday, next Tuesday?
Well, I think at sometime next week, we need to do an ad hoc. Well, I guess just before the next board meeting, we have ad hoc. So yeah, I'll be flexible. We can work around.
Paul, can't we do both of them that night?
Well, as
On the third.
Mr. Chapman just mentioned, we don't want too many people in the room.
Oh,
Well, I suppose people can leave.
I'll bring this up. There's nothing in state statute that says we can't continue using Zoom for committee meetings, especially if we've got to try to schedule them on top of each other. I know we all prefer to be in person, but you know, to get the business done without trying to stack committee meeting on top of committee meeting and keep our distances and our numbers in the rooms to a minimum. This, you know, there's nothing preventing us right now unless phase
Right.
4 says we can't do this anymore.
And it's just to bring forward a couple of resolutions. So I've got no problem doing Zoom, working this through Zoom.
because a couple of us would be on both those committees.
Right.
Several of us that are on the same committee, Paul, Dorothy, myself, and,
well,
You have a night suggestion, Ms. Squirrel, you have a night preference?
Tuesday would be fine on the 30th.
Okay. Yeah, I'm good. I'm clean. All right.
Yeah.
Mr. Chapman?
are we talking about a Zoom meeting then?
Whatever's the best.
Okay, we'll figure it out. Look, we have some other meetings too that we got to schedule, so let me work on it tomorrow and we'll try and, you know, figure it out one way or another, so.
Okay.
I just know for both of these committees, if you do it on Wednesday night, I won't be there. Because I'm
Okay.
not only on safety, but I'm also on the ad hoc committee. So Wednesday would be completely out for me.
Right.
Okay?
Okay, I'm very flexible. Thank you, Ms. Squirrel. Okay, I've got a motion to adjourn by Mr. Fellers and a second by Ms. Squirrel. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Public Safety Committee meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. If you can hear me, I have a couple of board members that I would like to request that they fill out their economic interest statement. They have not filled it out yet. So could Jazz Billich, Dave Fiducia, Jaime Salgado, and Fred Westcott. You can access this document on the homepage at winnebagocountyclerk.com. It's the first, at the bottom of the page, frequently asked questions. How do I fill out my statement of economic interest? If you could do that, we'd really appreciate it before we turn in your records to the state's attorney's office. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Angela Monday morning in the county clerk's office. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. Sorry I was a minute late. We can go ahead and call the meeting to order. There are no agenda updates, and with that, I will ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fiducia? Mr. Fiducia? Mr. Girl?
I'm here, present.
Mrs. Gorel?
Present.
Mr. Hoffman? Mr. Hoffman? Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly? I thought I saw Dave on. I think he's here. Mr. McDonald?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Neighbors?
Here.
Mrs. Red?
Here.
Mr. Salgado?
Present.
Mr. Schultz?
Here.
Mr. Tassoni?
Present.
Mr. Webster?
Here.
Mr. Westcott? Mr. Westcott? I thought he was on.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Zintak?
Here.
Thank you.
Present.
Welcome to the board. Mr. Arena?
Here.
Mr. Billich?
Here.
Mr. Booker?
Present.
Mr. Butita?
Here.
Mrs. Crosby?
Here.
Mr. Fellers?
Here.
Thank you. For the record, the two I have absent are Mr. Fiducia and Mr. Hoffman. So that's 2 absent, 18 present, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Clerk Emau, and welcome, Mr. Zintak, as well. I do believe Mr. Westcott is with us, so if he jumps in and confirms his attendance, we'll mark him absent at that time. I was just with Mr. Hoffman a half an hour ago, and he was going to run home and jump on this call, so I'm sure he'll be joining us very shortly. Now that we've called the meeting to order, I will turn things over and ask everybody to please stay seated for the invocation and the pledge, and I'm going to turn things over to Mr. Arena. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lord, we meet today to serve the people of Winnebago County. Unite us so we may move forward with a shared purpose. Guide our hearts and our minds to act in the spirit of fairness and with respect for different points of view. Lord, we give thanks for the men and women who do the work for our government. They have dedicated themselves to serve our community. We pray that you watch over our first responders and healthcare workers, keep them safe as they work to protect the lives of others. And Lord, please be with the Salgado family as they mourn the loss of their father. May the knowledge that he is with you, Lord, give them comfort in this difficult time. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
To the republic for which it stands,
one
One
nation,
nation,
under God, indivisible,
with
with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. We have no presentations tonight. Also, we do not have any public comment tonight. So with that, we'll move on to board member correspondence. Any board member comments this evening? Mr. Webster, I see your hand up. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. First, I just wanted to say welcome to Mike Zintak to his first meeting. Might be historical there that the first meeting a board member attends is a virtual one.
Thank you.
So anyways, glad that you're here, Mike. Next, I just got to say something. I want to take a minute to say I'm fed up with all the social BS that's going on in this country. The civil protest to anything is just fine, and we all have a right to do that. As long as it's nonviolent, great. But it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't have to devolve into setting our cities on fire, looting and burning of cop cars, tearing down statues, blocking streets, and pulling people out of cars and beating them. That's called anarchy. And the people doing that are anarchists. They should be treated as such. Lock them up, cages, treat them like the animals they are. Stop mollycoddling these people. I'm tired of that. I don't want to take away any rubber bullets, tear gas, water cannons, or any other means it takes to put an end to this type of anarchy, this type of violence. Defunding the police is the stupidest thing I've heard of. If we have to cut the sheriff's budget due to budget constraints, we don't have money or whatever, that's one thing. But I will never, ever, ever defund them due to a knee-jerk reaction to pacify a group of anarchists. Enough's enough. I've had it. It's time to defund these anarchists and put an end to this. Why do we put up with our cities getting burned to the ground? It's nonsense. And I understand the Black Lives Matter. I'm all for that. I'm here to support that as well. But it doesn't have to turn into the violence that it has. The people that are doing this calmly and protesting, that's their civil right. I'm behind them 100%. Others just turned into animals. There's no point in this. Thank you.
Mr. Neighbors, and then I believe Mr. Fellers had his hand up. Mr. Neighbors, you're up, sir.
Dan had his hand up first. He could go first.
No, go ahead, Mr. Neighbors. I definitely would rather defer to you.
Okay, to respond to Mr. Webster, first I'd like to say welcome, Mr. Zentak. Welcome to the county. Great to have you. And I just wanted to respond to Mr. Webster's comment. Mr. Webster, I totally respect you, but this opinion that you have, I cannot respect because we're in an unfair situation, and I understand that everyone wants to compare the situation now to Mr. George Floyd, and it's not just Mr. George Floyd. This is years and years and years of buildup, and right now we're in a perfect storm right now with COVID-19, people not being able to work, people being locked in. There's a lot of frustration built up, and I understand that, I don't condone the loot and everything going on, but at the same time, it's a lot of bad policing out there. There's a whole lot of good policing as well. I do commend those good officers, but just as you were saying, you call the people that are rioting anarchists. That's just unfair. I did not say all police were bad, and you put everybody in the same category. And we're in a perfect storm right now where they have nothing to lose right now, and because of COVID-19, they out of work, they're stuck at home, they're frustrated, and on top of that, we get stereotyped just because of the color of our skin. And so right now it's the perfect storm for them to go out and loot. And we all know American history. Nothing really changes until violence show up. I don't condone the violence, but we're still speaking about it because of the violence. And so if it was just a normal protest, I think the conversation would have ended a long time ago, just like it always does. And it's sad that it takes violence in order for everybody to listen. And, I don't want anybody to lose their lives. I don't want police officers to lose their lives. I don't want anyone to get hurt. But at the same time, we need to make change. And it's not really a black and white issue, because we have plenty of white supporters, and we're going to have a lot of white supporters, and most of those white supporters are liberals. And I call myself one of those old terms that we don't hear anymore. I'm a conservative Democrat. And so that's the way I view myself in the Democratic Party. You know, I'm one of the rare ones that do have conservative points of view, believe conservatively. But the group that has the power in America right now are the conservatives. And until we get to conservatives on board with changing some of those laws and ordinances and some of the things, that's when things are going to change. And it seems like the people that are against the protests, against the violence, against the riots, against everything that's going on right now are mostly the conservatives right now. It's not black and white, it's a conservative issue. And I just implore everybody, in order for us to get on the right track, I ask, I beg, I plead the conservatives to help us out, because you have the power to make everything better. You have the power to change the laws. You have the power to go to the legislators to help change the Supreme Court, because right now we have a conservative Supreme Court. And until we get the legislators to help push the conservatives into some of those policies, it's going to keep being the same thing and keep being repeated and keep everything's going to keep going the way everything was in the past. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to speak at this moment. And I hope everybody consider what I said and go forward with some change in their heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you. I think Mr. Neighbors said it perfectly.
Any other board member comments? Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Neighbors. There is another conservative branch of the Republican Party called the Libertarians, of which I have been a part for 30 years, and we think similarly.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Any other comments by board members?
Just one quick one.
Follow up, Mr. Webster. You have the floor, sir.
Yeah, just one quick one. Tim, I'm not lumping everybody as an anarchist. That's not what I'm saying. And it's not just black people out there that are doing the burning the cars and pulling people out and beating on them and pulling down statues. There's just as many whites in that crowd, those crowds that we see on television, just as many whites as there are blacks. So I'm not saying these anarchists are drawn down one race. They're not. But the people that are doing that sort of activity are anarchists. Peaceful protests are one thing. That's fine. I have no issue with that whatsoever. But when you start burning our cities down to the ground, that's no way to make a statement. That just makes this whole country worse. Thank you.
Any other comments by board members? Yes, Mr. Schultz. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is obviously a topic where angels fear to tread. But, you know, we've all been doing a lot of thinking and praying about this issue because it's in front of us again. And, you know, I don't know what it's like to be discriminated against or have prejudiced thoughts about me because of the color of my skin. I know that I have the advantages of being a white male, and those advantages are being brought home in a way that's more significant than at any other time in my life. And I do think we have to examine ourselves in the midst of this. I think all of us are in that place where we have to look into our own hearts and our own minds and see what's there. And to the extent that there's work that needs to be done, I think we need to do that hard work. I also believe that we are not in a nation where the opportunities are equal, and we need to face up to that. And I think there are people that have real solutions, and we need to listen to them. We need to listen to those that are suffering. We need to care about those that are suffering. The COVID-19 is falling on the most vulnerable of our citizens, just like most of our calamities do. And we have to take that seriously. We have to look at how we allocate our resources. We have to consider, what is it going to take for us to have opportunities made available to people who have experienced prejudice on a generation to generation basis. And I'm the last one to say that I think this is an easy thing for us to solve, but I will say it is not a political problem. And it does bother me deeply when I see politics becoming the driver of the conversations that we're having right now, where one party is viewed as, well, that's their issue, or there they go again, that's how they talk, that's the thing they care about. No, we all have to care about this, and we all have to engage. And we have opportunities in front of us. So I'm not without hope, but I know I've been challenged, and we all have been. And it's a matter of prayer for all of us, and I hope we can do better. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I speak for a minute, please?
Yes, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mrs. Red, then Mr. Girl. Mrs. Red, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. I feel that I need to say something. I'm from the 60s era, and I have experienced discrimination all of my life. Like Mr. Schultz said, some of you, maybe none of you, have experienced that. But today is 2020. This should not be here today. I mean, look at the time. But some parents taught their children these things. Don't speak to him or don't speak to her because she's Black, she'll do bad things. But that's not right. And even today, people that look like me might apply for a job and they have to have more education than that white person. It's not right and it's not fair. All of you need to search your hearts. We can do better, but you have to want to do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Red. Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to use this opportunity to say that I absolutely agree with Mr. Steve Schultz. So I have to use all the opportunities I can to say that. So I believe that he is correct. I've been praying for the last few months that we can come together, put politics aside, come up with real solutions, listen to the problems, listen to the solutions that are being presented to us as government officials. This isn't about politics. It shouldn't be about party politics at all. Our founding fathers never intended on there to be partisan politics. We were always supposed to work together for the greater good of this country, to represent the people that we represent and to be their voice. So I hope that this board takes the initiative and actually listens to the folks, and we try to do the best that we can moving forward, because it takes all of us to care. That's how we get through things. When we come together and we work together, that's when we succeed. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Girl. Any other comments by board members? Seeing none, move on to Chairman's report. I'll be brief tonight. I do have a couple things I just want to make sure that have come to your attention. The first is you should have received, as promised, an update on the Winnebago County Trustee Program auction in the form of a press release from our one planning council. They had a very successful first round, and you should have that in your inbox. We can resend that if needed. The couple things that have come to light is there was concern that going to an online approach would somehow limit access. Actually, we've seen nearly 2,000 unique users went to the auction website. That is much different than the old days of some of the auctions, and much more inclusive of our community as a whole, which is a good thing, making for more competitive discussions. So the success in the transition related to that first auction is very positive. It bodes well. We are still managing a rather difficult transition. What I would say is if you don't believe me on the need to make the transition we made, continue to talk to our municipal partners who were the most directly affected by the program and who are the ones indicating happiness with the transition itself in terms of customer service from the agent and I think ultimately increased money for maintenance and also increased money to taxing bodies being the goal in getting these properties back on the property tax rolls. I am going to continue to celebrate the success of this transition because it took a very long time to get there. And I'm very excited about that. Two is yesterday, there was an email that I sent. It was to Mrs. Crosby at her request, but I CC'd the board because these are things that we've done over the last few years. I think her, Steve Chapman, and maybe a board member or two as well. I think Mr. Billick is on a committee. There's some different working groups related to the future in the community, and there's a government efficiency group. And there was some discussion about how do we work together going forward. One of the things I was asked to do is put together a list that I shared with you all regarding things this county board has either supported or have been community conversations involving multiple entities. Take a look at that. If there's anything that's misrepresented or incorrect, please let me know. If there's anything missing that you feel were multi-agency discussions around efficiency or effectiveness of public entities, let me know. We can update that list. But if there's any ideas going forward, please make sure you share them as well. Lastly, back a week and a half ago now, I sent around and I've had several discussions. I want to thank Mrs. Red, Mrs. Gorel, Mrs. Crosby, and several others regarding some policy suggestions that were emailed out related to some community discussions going on. Happy to discuss any ideas that you have that are better or different related to what was shared in that document. I know there were several comments made in response to Mr. Webster's initial comment. Particular agree with Mr. Neighbors and appreciated Mr. Schultz's comments as well. I would say I would choose my words much differently than Mr. Webster, but I respect his right to share his opinion on this matter and any other for that matter. I do not have any other items at this time, but would move on to announcements and communications. Clerk Gummau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items below were received as correspondence.
We will go ahead and place those on file. Thank you very much. Our next item is the consent agenda. It includes the raffle report, the bills, approval of May 14th minutes, and the May 22nd or May 20th minutes, and laying over the June 11th minutes. May I please have a motion on these four items? I got a motion by Mrs. Crosby, second by Mr. Neighbors and Mr. Kelly. Any discussion on the consent agenda before the board? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Either speak now or indicate by raising your hand now. I do not see any objection or hear any objection, so I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much. Next item of business is the administrator's report. Steve, are you there?
Yes, sir. I have no report tonight, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Steve. Department head updates. Any department head updates this evening? Seeing none, we'll move on to standing committee reports. Finance Committee, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We don't have a report for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster.
We have no report.
Thank you. Economic Development Committee, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report tonight.
Operations Committee, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee has an ordinance, and it looks like 5 resolutions before us this evening. The The first is an ordinance amending Chapter 50 of the Winnebago County Code of Ordinances related to food establishment operations during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was laid over from the June 11th, 2020 meeting.
Okay, I did entertain a motion to approve that since that's laid over and it's up for vote tonight. Is that okay, Mr. McDonald?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'd entertain a motion. Mr. Kelly on the motion, Mr. Neighbors on the second. So now the item is before the board for discussion. Mr. McDonald, I'll go to you for any initial comments. And if this works for folks, I know we have Dr. Martell with us tonight. I know there's been questions. I think there was a little bit of confusion initially. There may be some policy disagreement, but I just want to make sure before we vote that we're clear on what is and what is not the facts around and context around this. And then whatever the board decides, they decide. But Mr. McDonald, any initial comments as the committee chairman?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do. Thank you very much. I'm conflicted on this. I see it, and I talked to Charlotte Leclerc today as well, and Dr. Martell, I'm going to give the summary of it as I understand it. But currently, if the health department shuts down the restaurant, they could do it until the restaurant owner is able to get in front of a judge to say, no, you can't do that. So by passing this, in fact, we could speed a restaurant's time back to reopen, which I think is a positive thing. The thing that I think is negative is it leaves the judge and the jury in the health department's court as well. So it makes me a little bit nervous that there's so much power or lack of another opinion to make sure everything is on the up and up. That makes me nervous. I plan on making a motion later to amend this so it's only for 60 days because as written, it goes on forever. So I would like to make a motion to amend this so it's only for 60 days effective. And then the other thing, if Dr. Martell, correct me if I got that information. Charlotte was saying earlier that there's no fines, there's no monies attached to any of this, so there won't be any revenue exchanging hands. Is that accurate as well?
That's correct.
Dr. Martell, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's correct. There's no money associated with this.
Mr. McDonald, I know you have an amendment coming. Would it be okay with you where no one's going to get in the way of you making a motion, but can we talk about what the actual policy item is? Let's agree if it's okay with the board not to call the question. We do want to give Mr. McDonald the option to bring his motion forward to amend, but I know there's been a lot of confusion over what some of the facts and nuance are on this. And if we could just sort that out and then deal on the timing piece with your motion, if that's okay with you, Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Okay. If it's okay, then I'm going to, Dr. Martell, is there anything you want to add around if you feel there's certain pieces of this that are being perhaps that need to be reclarified so that we're all on the same page over what the board's actually voting on and what the consequences of approving this or not approving this would mean to your department?
The premise has not changed and why the Board of Health was advancing it to the county board for consideration, because under the executive orders, especially as it relates to food establishments, the only tool that we have is a closure rather than the in-house hearing process. And Mr. McDonald's right, it is an in-house hearing process, so it is conducted at the health department, but the inspector who is making the inspection is not the one that hears the information. There is a supervisor that reviews it, and typically a plan. The goal is to work out a plan for bringing the establishment into compliance before we hit a closure.
Do you, Dr. Martell, are you gaining new powers you didn't have if the board says yes to this?
No, let me be clear that the authority for a closure resides in the health department.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. I asked that knowing the answer. I just wanted to be clear on that so it was on record. I do see a couple hands up. I'm going to move off then and go to Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Martell, this resolution states that the health department would be able to establish what the guidelines are. Is that currently within your power that you establish the guidelines for operation of bars and restaurants?
The guidelines flow from the Illinois Department of Public Health, and as the delegate health department, our authority flows from the state.
Okay, but this says that under this, the health department would establish the guidelines. Isn't that what I'm reading here?
That is with the authority of the Illinois Department of Public Health.
But I'm reading the document that we're going to vote on, and that's not what it says in the document. So I want everyone to be clear that there is a conflict between the language in the document and that. My second question is, are you saying that currently the health department has no authority in its that adjudication process to impose a fine?
That is correct. We do not impose a fine through this process.
You are choosing not to impose a fine, or you don't have the authority to impose a fine? Can you impose a fine in other circumstances? If somebody, I don't know, doesn't take out their garbage or whatever other types of hearings you hold internally, can you impose fines?
The ordinance for the food establishment does not permit us to levy a fine.
Okay, and that's why this might be different than other circumstances?
The ordinance as we're proposing does not include a fine.
Okay, and then my next question is, currently, I talked to Charlotte also, and the way it was explained to me is if the health department wants to take action against a bar or restaurant, you can close it down, and then within 48 hours, you have to go before a judge. It's the health department's the one that has the obligation to go to court for the court to certify your action. Is that correct?
We have to file the petition to court within 48 hours of issuing a closure notice. That is correct.
Right. And in this case, so under the current circumstances, the defendant would have appear before a judge within 48 hours. That 48 hours timeline isn't there anymore. How long until someone gets into a hearing?
Typically, those hearings are scheduled almost immediately. For instance, we would go in, and it depends upon the violation again. So if something that could be immediately corrected, they take the steps to immediately correct it or put a plan of action in place to correct whatever the issue is. So again, this is part of our routine. We typically, on a food establishment, for instance, we've talked about this before, if there was a violation, we would go through, we would identify that violation, we would work through the process of getting that violation corrected. Some of them can be corrected immediately on site. Others take time to implement that. And as long as it does not, require, if we see there's progress and it does not put the public's health in immediate danger, then we can work through that process.
So then it's possible for the restaurant or bar to remain open while they remedy the situation?
It depends upon the violation level, but yes.
Thank you. Thank you for answering my question.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Any other questions by board members? Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Martell, I got a phone call today. I heard something about there's been 40 restaurants shut down already. Can you elaborate or fill us in on what's going on?
Yes. Let me confirm, there are not 40 restaurants that have been shut down. We inspected last evening a total of 15 bars, restaurants that were in violation of the executive order because they were doing indoor dining. These institutions had documented complaints as well as complaints regarding masks and other issues. So we went out on the 15 establishments, and then only 3 were identified as violating the executive order. So again, we do not just simply close or issue a hearing notice on simply an unvalidated inspection. So we went out to the facility. So if the bar stools were up on the tables and chairs and there was no evidence that food was being served indoors, they did not result in a we asked for voluntary closure. 3 establishments voluntarily closed upon inspection, and these were also identified by the same city. 2 of them were in a community. The police department was very much aware and had also received prior complaints. So these were known violators.
And not just the first time you were there, you've got history with it?
We had history with it. That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you for cleaning that up. Mr. Fellers, then Mr. Bill. Mr. Fellers, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just took one question for Dr. Martell, just to kind of clarify a statement earlier. You mentioned that your authority comes from the state of Illinois, right? And as item G in the ordinance reads, guidelines developed by the Winnebago County Health Department and the state of Illinois for safe operation of their facilities. Is that saying that they are giving you a set of guidelines and you get to pick and choose? Or is that saying that these guidelines come from the state of Illinois, we are taking these guidelines and we are implementing these guidelines as given to us by the state of Illinois with our authority as the county health board?
That is correct.
Okay, so the guidelines come from the state. You say, thank you for these guidelines. We are now using the guidelines the state gave us.
Correct, unless there is and I will be clear, there's sometimes they will give something within the local health department. And as you know, we've put out community guidelines that were put together with a working group in our community for that.
Great, thank you. And I would just like to add that I think the Winnebago County Health Department is doing an absolutely wonderful job given the difficult circumstances we're in, given that our 14-day average continues to fall, despite counties around us continue to be holding steady or rising. Please keep doing the great work that you're doing.
Thank you. And it really is a testament to our community. And when you think about it, only having to really inspect 15 establishments, of only which 3 had demonstrated violations, I think speaks to how much our community and our businesses have really followed and gotten the message and really worked through this process. And we could not do that without them.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers, Dr. Martell. Mr. Billick, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Martell, I may ask a couple questions too. I do want to follow up on what Paul Arena actually asked you. Now, in regards to the fines, not in regards to this ordinance, does the health department issue any fines to restaurants and bars?
Under the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, there are fines associated with violations of the Smoke-Free Illinois Act.
Are there any other kinds of fines that the health department does?
Across all of our environmental programs or just food establishments?
I guess more so in regards to food establishments, but just as a generalization, you do charge fines to other kinds of violations that the health department is in charge of, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And I guess a follow up with that though, did that working group that you discussed with as far as for the restaurants and for the reopening, did that working group actually include other restaurant owners in that?
There was approximately 60 restaurant establishment owners and or managers who they sent in their place.
Okay. In regards to this ordinance, was it specifically discussed to not have a fine?
Well, we are not fining them under this particular ordinance. We don't have the authority to fine them under this ordinance. City of Rockford may have authority under their municipal code to fine establishments, but the Winnebago County Health Department does not have a fine associated with this ordinance.
Okay. And just to follow up with what Dan Fowler was actually referencing as well, if I may, I believe that his question was more along the lines of, do we have latitude in regards to what the recommendations are from the state? And the reason why I ask is because obviously there has been talk and there has been other communities that have created their own kind of regulations of what they want and have kind of opened up a little bit more in regards to the restaurant and bar industries. I don't know 100% if we followed up with that. I obviously have been very busy myself. So is there any kind of validity to that, or is that something that there's an opportunity for?
Where they have given us latitude, we are attempting to exercise it as appropriate. Probably we've not seen that in the food establishments as much. And again, that was an equity issue and concern across the state. I know that, you know, and you can imagine when you think about how many, we have approximately about 900 to 1,000 permitted food establishments in Winnebago County. And when you think about that, and we have 15 that we received significant complaints on, right? So it wasn't a one-up, and you know, you think about that, the majority of establishments were in compliance. What you have to be thoughtful about, I mean, right now the big debate, as you would guess, is you saw the indoor capacity. Our group had wanted at least 50% capacity, and the state actually expanded that, right? The state allowed them to have as much capacity as 6 feet of social distancing between tables and parties of 10, right? So the next question, we do not have a significant latitude. If it says 50 is for a restaurant, for a banquet facility, we cannot go to 100. And so we do not have latitude as it exists, as depending upon how the executive order is written.
Okay. And in regards to that, what you just mentioned with the 6 feet in between tables, now there's a lot of discussion between percentages and how much percentage of their occupancy they can be open. Do we have a definitive method that we are going to be going with on that?
Okay, the definitive method is they have to have 6 feet of social distancing between tables. So a large floor plan, one of our establishments here has a very large footprint, right? They can probably, their capacity would be different than a storefront type restaurant that can only place so many feet between. But for instance, it'll talk about booths in the executive order from DCOE, right? And the guidance is regarding either putting plexiglass up or some barrier between booths. Then we will work with the establishment. We have some that are installing, I'm going to call like shower curtains in between, right? As a temporary. And we've worked out the plan. Then you have to wash the shower curtain between, you have to put a fresh one up every time someone comes into that booth. But again, those are some of the areas where there is group discretion to make sure that we're meeting the spirit and condition of really maintaining the public safety and health in this situation.
Okay. And I do want to actually commend you on one thing because, and absolutely commend the health department on the fact of the effectiveness of what you guys have done at the beginning of this, attacking the issues of setting up test sites and facilities, the PPE, the protective measures that you guys did with face masks and so on and so forth. My concern though does stem from what the residents have called me on, what other business owners have called me on. I've had about probably at least 15 to 20 calls already, and they're really concerned about it. Fact of the matter is they're concerned with the fact that it's going to be a hard close for them. Majority of our restaurants and bars have suffered already, and this is a new program for them to follow as well. So again, as much as we give credit to where credit's due with the county board and with the county health department and everyone else having to deal with this situation and trying to adjust as much as we can, the restaurant owners are very concerned with the fact that it's more going to be about policing rather than actually helping make sure that this is going to be progressive and proactive type of measure. So one of the concerns that they have is the fact that it's going to be solely under the discretion of one department. Again, that's why I bring it up. I did have, and I kid you not, my phone has not stopped ringing as far as that is concerned. I appreciate the methods that you guys go through. I just want to make sure that this is going to be protecting every single establishment, and it's going to be very fair across the board. At this stage, there's a lot of concern on how that is going to play out. Currently, there was an establishment actually that reached out to me as well that already had a call about a mask, and then at the same time, all their staff members have masks on in for example, with bandanas or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And they keep their masks on as far as right here because not every customer prefers the mask. And they do put the mask on in regards to those customers. So when they got a call in regards to somebody that was in here that actually didn't have the mask presented all the way on, and then followed up with that, they got a call from the health department. They just seemed a little off put because it seems like they're almost going to be targeted.
Again, and I Does it feel like they're going to be targeted? I can't respond to that. What we have is every time a consumer complaint comes in, are we going on? We get multiple questions. I'm going to say multiple complaints in a day of all kinds of establishment where masks are not being worn or gloves are not being used in a way that the public feels that they should be. Of course, we always advise the public never to take into an altercation with anyone who is not wearing a mask. If you can move out of the vicinity of someone, if you're going down an aisle in a store, so food establishments are not the only complaints we receive. We receive them from everything from workplaces to our big box stores. And we really want to encourage individuals, if you see that, move away. If you feel uncomfortable, don't go to that establishment. And we've really encouraged them on the Clean Hands, Open Doors campaign that's been put on by our Visitors and Convention Bureau that really says these establishments are signing on. They understand the importance of this because at the end of the day, the success of any of our businesses returning either to us as consumers or employees will be that they need to feel safe in those environments. And the most recent University of Michigan survey came out and said 61% said they are not going to go into an establishment unless they feel that those protective measures are being taken seriously. And so right now, if we get a complaint, we will call them and say, is it your policy that employees wear masks? Are there going to be times when they see employees that have pulled the mask down if they themselves are eating or having a drink or they're outstanding, waiting? Again, we hear this. And if we find out there's multiple complaints about masks not being worn, then we have to kind of go in from a safety standpoint from the food establishment. Is this included in their health plan, which all food establishments are required to have as part of the public health? And unfortunately, I am the one with the authority on this one in the health department. And I don't want to have to engage law enforcement for something like this. It does not bode well. What we want to do is people to come into compliance because they understand the importance. And if a client asks someone to put a mask on because they are going to serve them, to put the mask on. Right. And again, understanding that this is the standard that we are expecting in our community, that the Clean Hands, Open Doors, that's part of that campaign. So I understand it feels, but remember, it's the public reporting these. We are not out there just doing, kind of randomly checking. These are in response to complaints from the public.
Thank you, Dr. Martell, on that response. I will ask one more question, if I may, and to move on to the next person. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for giving me the floor. Dr. Martell, I will ask this question though, because in regards to what you just said, with it being a requirement, if I may be mistaken, I apologize. I do not have it in front of me. However, I've reread it about 60 times in regards to what the state has recommended and what they are requiring. In regards to face masks. And if I'm not mistaken, it is not required unless asked by a customer, or it's one of those, I guess it is required only if asked by a customer. If it is not asked by a customer, it is not required for the individual to have a face mask on. Am I wrong in that or correct in that?
And if you're if you have to get within 6 feet of social distance, and again, I come back to what we tell the establishment is your customers are noting that your staff are not wearing masks. And what we hear most of the time, I'm going to say 99.9% of the time. And so I didn't do a statistical analysis, is most of the time, all of our operators are saying, oh no, we provide the mask. We tell them to wear them when they're serving customers. So these are oftentimes one-offs, I'm going to call it, right? And again, the bottom line is that as we want to protect the public's health, as we want to take a look and make sure we can keep that curve flat so businesses can continue to open and operate safely, that they understand that the public is watching and we respond to the public complaints. We do that now. If someone says they were in a restaurant and they got a dirty glass and the person did not respond appropriately, we go in and say, are the dishwashers working? Is everything, how would that be handled? I also want to, like any of us, we always have to be on our best behavior when we ask someone to do something that they're not doing at the present time. So if someone feels uncomfortable when their server comes into their physical space to serve them the food, And they, what we've heard is some people may refuse to wear that mask. And again, what I don't want are people getting into altercations in these settings. We want to make this a pleasant experience so people want to go back to the establishment. And again, I come back to, we often know we'll take a look at the policies and procedures in place. Are there signs up? If our server, does it imply that they understand that that they're serving now food and to a public during a pandemic?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Martell. And I'll raise my hand. I want to go on to the other county board members so they have their time. I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Haney. All right, Chairman, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Bellick. Thank you, Dr. Martell, for the commentary. I know there was a lot to pull out and untangle with this discussion and other things that touch this vote on this particular policy. If there are any board members that have any additional questions, if there isn't, then I'm going to go back to Mr. McDonald to make his motion if he still wants to do that. I don't see any other hands up. So Mr. McDonald, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I make a motion, we amend this to be effective for 60 days.
So there's a motion by Mr. McDonald to amend the time length to a 60-day. We'd revisit this in 60 days. So a motion by Mr. McDonald is that this would be a 60-day window. And may I have a second? Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Billick on the second. The motion to make this a 60-day sunset, I guess, is before the board for discussion. Currently, or before the motion was made by Mr. McDonald, it did not have a sunset date. It was because this is a COVID-related item, that it would go on through the COVID discussion, which likely will go on past 60 days in some form or fashion. But the motion is for a 60-day sunset. It could be revisited at the particular time if the board so chose. Is that the right spirit of what we're talking about, Mr. McDonald? Okay. Yep. Okay, confirm that. Mr. Fellers, go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I'm curious here. With a 60-day sunset, assuming that we are still in a pandemic situation more than 60 days from now, it would simply revert back to the current situation, which is actually what we want to avoid, which would be that this would go immediately to a judge or have to go through a petition through the court systems, which may delay any kind of reopening or anything else. I'm just kind of curious why we want to put a 60-day sunset on this when this seems to be a more flexible solution to the problem. Thank you.
I'm going to go back to Mr. McDonald. It was his motion, and I'll let him give his justification for it. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This very well could be the direction we need to go, and that's why I don't want to kill it. I don't want to do anything. I would rather give the health department 60 days to see how it goes, see how the system's handled and managed, and the fact that it makes sure and validate that it really is the direction we need to go instead of passing something that's going to last forever. I'm optimistic that things are going to do well. It's going to help restaurant owners stay in business, keep their doors open, keep customers coming in the doors. And before 60 days, we should make a motion or bring it in front of us once again.
Any other questions or comments on the motion, amended motion that is before the board? Mr. Billick. Oh, unpause or unmute yourself, Mr. Billick.
I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will say, I don't know if Paul still had something he wanted to say. His hand did shoot up. If we can actually go to, no, Paul? Okay. I just want to ask in regards to Mr. Fellers on this one, if we give a 60-day window, I mean, we can always re-up it. But at the same time, we don't know that it's actually going to last, this pandemic shutdown in this regard, that we're going to enter some kind of regressive phase where we're going to have to go back into shutdown again. That is something that's merely discussed. We don't know that for sure. However, at this stage, I can tell you right now that a lot of businesses are trying to progress through this motion to actually maintain a business and be open. At this stage, if they go back anymore, we're likely to lose a lot of restaurant and bars in this area. And at this time, I can tell you right now, it is painful, it is heartfelt, and I could cry to you if you want me to, but I can tell you right now that I've actually listened to other bar restaurant owners cry because of how much business they're actually losing between here and other municipalities that literally neighbor ours. So
it fair,
I just want to make sure to clarify, I support what Mr. McDonald said there, to give it a 60 days and see how it goes from there. So.
Mr. Billick, is it safe to say, just so I capture the spirit of this, I'm making sure I understand it myself in case I need to vote, in case this is a tie, is the spirit behind what you're talking about is there's been some heartburn on this topic. There's a lot of other issues that people have concerns about, but this would give the health department a tool in the short term, and we test run it, see how it goes, and we'd have some information to compare it to. And then we could always extend it in the future past the 60 days if things go as many believe it will, but it would automatically end if there's problems. So I guess, is it a way for some folks who might not support an indefinite proposal to get on board in the short term and try it out? Is that kind of what I'm hearing from people who maybe had major concerns 2 weeks ago, have heard some information from Dr. Martell, and they feel a little bit better about it, but they'd like a test run kind of thing?
I'm not going to say no, but not 100% yes either. I will mention that some people's concern would be that, sure, and that would meet that concern. There's other concerns which I'll bring up later, but in regards to this motion, will it help or will it be some kind of, sorry for the terrible metaphor, but some form of one-tums to just kind of calm down the burn over this? Yes, it will help. However, at the same time, I don't think it's going to make everyone completely happy. If anything, they probably wanted it for a shorter amount of time because they're hoping that we're just going to keep progressing positively and get past this pandemic. And again, this is with regards to everyone wanting to be safe still as well. So they're hoping that we can keep progressing forward instead of regressing.
Understood. Thank you very much. There was another hand up, I think, Mr.
Chair,
Salgado.
I would like to make a comment after too.
Sure, I'm going to go Mr. Salgado, then Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question for Dr. Martell. Based on essentially the phases that we move in, obviously there's different phases that we move into different directions. And how is this tied to that? For example, say in 40 days, we decide we're at this hypothetical, we're at the last stage or whatever that we are. How does this go away? How does that work? And kind of going back to Mr. Fellers, because I think it's a good question to ask. Is what happens then after, after 60 days and we're at a different stage, and then we notice that we have to backtrack. Do policies change? I just want to make sure, that is it phased in the different phases that we have, or how is that taken into account? Because I'll be honest with you, I do understand Mr. Billich. I understand I've gotten calls from different perspectives. Most recently, the city market, we had discussions about that, knowing that the 26th of June, which is Friday, we're going phase 4. So there was, discussion about that, and we were able to remedy some of that. And not every business though has the opportunity to have the discussion with the health department and actually work something out in that direction. But I just wanted to see how the phasing that we're at, if that's this ordinance and how that flows. So much. We can do 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever we want, as long as we're, like I always said to the folks, as long as we're abiding to the guidelines that are currently in place. I have no issue. If you could just answer that question, Dr. Martell, on the phasing based on this ordinance.
Well, I think part of it is none of us want to step back. Let's be clear, not one of us, but we suspect that we'll be in 4. 5 is I'm going to say 5 is when the pandemic is over, right? But we know that there'll be steps along the way. And the most recent guidance, is you start looking at, let's say in 2 months, then we may be able to get to the banquet facilities having more individuals, right? So that the new information, the executive orders will come out and they'll do different things. It could be that, you know, again, as we go into different phases, either there'll be an expansion, you know, versus you might be able to get to 200, but not 500, right? So I think that we're trying to be kind of not have to go back every time, but I understand the concern about making sure that it works well for the, you know, for the community. Our goal was to put another step in there so that closure wasn't the only tool that we had when there was a violation. And, you know, I have to come back to, and I said, when I say when there's multiple violations of the same, you know, I'm going to say the same type error, we're going to call it. But, you know, we also heard from our local business establishments, hey, I've been following the rules. I've been doing what I need to do. I've not been doing indoor dining, and I find these folks are doing, you know, indoor dining. And so again, we're really wanting to make sure that we have some other step in place, because typically most institutions, most establishments, most stores, they really want to stay open and do the best they can moving forward. And, you know, and I have to say that to the 3 that were identified, they self-closed, recognizing they were in the detention zone, I'm going to call it. They had not done the right thing. But again, we really have to kind of think this is going to be a fluid, and when I say fluid, you know, people have asked, is there going to be a second wave? It might be like a roller coaster. We might have some ups and downs and hills and valleys where we have to kind of limit the number of people at a table or do something else that, you know, as we move through some of this. But I think we have to be, you know, what we don't have to want to do is come back every time and you know, discuss it unless there's been significant violations going on. But understand this pandemic will be with us for a while, and it's tied to the emergency declaration related to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Martell. Thank you, Mr. Salgado. So really, the phasing is important, of course, but it is separate and not directly tied to this particular ordinance. We all want to keep going forward, but even if we don't go forward, we go backwards, this ordinance could still play a role in future efforts, good or bad. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, and I don't know how much of, you know, who follows what in the news as it relates to other states on this. But if you look at the states that, you know, reopened around Memorial Day weekend, Texas, Arizona, California, et cetera, some of those, Arizona and Texas in particular, are really in dire straits. Houston and Dallas hospitals are nearing 100% ICU capacity. Arizona, especially Maricopa County, you know, their caseload, their hospitalizations are up 77%, right? And these are all states that at one point had a downward trend. If you look at Illinois, we've held steady. If you look at Winnebago County, we've continued to drop, and we've continued to do the good things. And that's so much a testament to, you know, this sort of slow, methodical approach to this. And again, I can't say how thankful I am for our health department in this.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Do I see a hand up, Mrs. Crosby or Mrs. Crosby?
I bet.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
no,
thank
sorry.
you.
I got to take the floor back from Mrs. Crosby. Give it to Mrs. Gorel. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Do I go first?
No, Angie does. Go ahead, Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree with Dan. I've been watching it too, looking at all this cross country and what's happening and how so many of them are going backwards. My question is, first of all, I want to compliment our area for being so good about following what they're supposed to be doing. And that way we get through this faster. My second question is, when does this start and when does it end if we do a 60-day? When would the first day begin?
Upon passage. Upon passage. So if you pass it tonight, it begins, the ordinance would take effect tonight, and it would go from 60 days, 60, not business days, 60 calendar days.
Yeah.
And so we'd have to bring it back, in all honesty, in about 30 days, because it would likely lay over as ordinances do, right? So we'd have to probably bring it back fairly quickly. However, that is the amended motion that is before the board, is the 60-day item.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Crosby, thank you, Mrs. Guerrero. Mrs. Crosby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to compliment Dr. Martell on her good work. She's had her hands full in multiple ways, and she's done a wonderful job. On the flip side to that, you can see Dr. Martell, according to what Mr. McDonald reported, there were some 30 or 40 folks out there that thought that somebody thought were shut down in the restaurants. So when ripples translate through the restaurant community, we have to be very cognizant of the fear factor and make sure right and proper information is being disseminated to everybody, because there is a fear factor. And I want the restaurant owners in Rockford to understand, and Winnebago County to understand that, and I believe this in the most incredible way, Dr. Martell, that your systems are fair and equitable. So I don't know how you have to get that message out there, but you need to get it out there. Secondly, without the 60-day timeline, I can't support this. So I completely support what Keith has proposed, because it puts a avenue for the restaurants to understand it's 60 days. And at the end of 60 days, if we need to extend it, we can. But these guys have to understand that there's equity, there's compassion, there's fair play for all these restaurant owners, and they're not going to get persecuted because they have this huge fear factor that you're going to come in, clean their clock, and put them out of business. And we don't want them to have that. We want them to know that you're a partner with them and you're willing to work with them to get them compliant. So right now, I don't think we have that message out there based on simply what Keith McDonald said tonight. So we have to do some great PR work and explain to them the good work you have already done and the good work you're willing to do. And that really does conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments by board members? Oh, Mr. Neighbors, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to not reiterate, just give from a different point of view on the ordinance. I look at it as a way, not necessarily putting more restrictions on the restaurants, more so than I look at it as giving the public a sense of comfort going out to these restaurants, because a lot of people aren't going to the restaurants that are open because they're scared. And if we put this ordinance out and give them a sense of comfort that we have their back on protecting them from the COVID with the clean hands and clean face, then I think more people will come out to these restaurants just knowing that they have a sense of protection. And I know it's hard more guidelines to go by or more supervision, but at the same time, I think it'll benefit the restaurants so that they could get more customers to come out. And I know it's a lot of people that don't believe in what's going on and think they should be able to go out free facing them, but it doesn't hurt anything. In fact, we had the numbers that our hospital beds are low. We still have a lot of empty hospital beds because we're taking the proper precautions. And I think with this precaution added, I think more people will be willing to come out and visit those restaurants that aren't getting visited. And I welcome the 60-day sunset, because that'll give us a test of things to come and see how it improved and our numbers going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Neighbors. I did see one last hand up, I thought. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Something else occurred to me. Dr. Martell, I was just reading through section G again, And so it talks about you giving them written notice of non-compliance and an opportunity to come into compliance. And then if they don't, their food permit can be suspended. So at what point in this process is the defendant able to file for administrative review? So if they object initially to the allegation that they're out of compliance, are they immediately able to file for administrative review, or are they not? Do they have to wait until their permit is suspended?
Dr. Martell?
Well, we typically allow them to file at that time. You know, again, if they feel that it's not accurate information, at that point, we can go right straight to, you know, the closure in the court system.
So you have to close them before they could go to have the case heard before a judge?
That's how we go to a hearing officer at the court systems, yes.
If you suspend the food permit and then they don't go the route of filing an action for administrative review, how do they get their permit reinstated? Just by coming into compliance?
Mhm.
Yes, by coming into compliance, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions by board members on the amended motion? Mr. Billick on a follow-up?
Just to follow up, what Mr. Arena just said, Dr. Martell, if I may just, so if they immediately come into compliance, they will not be shut down, is what you're saying?
Absolutely. That's how this works now, for instance, and you're in the food industry, so you know this. So we come in and we find out that the dish temperature, you know, the dishwasher temperature isn't correct. And they say, I've got a service call in here, right? So we would go through, they're going to send us, and we say, okay, when the repair gentleman comes in, send us the repair ticket. We typically then remove that and they can get back into operation. And so we do this as a routine basis as part of this process.
Any other questions by board members on the amended motion to have a 60-day sunset built into the ordinance that is before the board?
We haven't amended the motion yet, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, we had a motion and a second by Mr. McDonald was the motion, and then Mrs. Crosby seconded. It was just a while ago, so, but we do have.
We have the amended. You already said the motion was amended. We have an amendment to the.
Yes, thank you. You got it. So the motion before the board and that has been seconded is to amend the motion. My apologies. Thank you, Mr. Fellers. That is before the board. A yes vote at this time would amend to 60-day sunset. A no vote would leave the original motion before the board for a follow-up separate action this evening. Either way, we have a separate action, but a yes vote would just merely amend it to the 60-day sunset. A no vote leaves it where it's at. Any other discussions on the specific to the motion to have a 60-day sunset? Again, a yes vote will amend it to 60-day sunset. A no vote leaves it as is for separate action this evening. With that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. Clerk, come out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott. Has Mr. Westcott not joined us?
He is on the call, but he still hasn't weighed in to confirm his attendance.
Okay. Mr. Zintak,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Mr. Fellers,
Yes.
and I believe Mr. Fiducia is still absent. So motion passes with 18 present, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We've amended the motion now. That is the action item, the 60-day sunset tied into the ordinances before the board. Are there any other discussions about our amended motion before we take a vote? Mr. Billick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couple more concerns, but a couple questions actually as well. One of my concerns is, or one of my questions is this: if we do not pass this resolution, we are still technically, as far as the restaurants and bars are, they're still technically able to open under the what the IDPH has actually set forth, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So regardless of whether we pass this or not, the restaurants are still going to be open, but under obviously regulations that were set forth by the Illinois Department of Health.
There's every belief we're going to phase 4 tomorrow. That is a separate issue altogether.
Correct. I understand that. What I'm saying is, does this resolution actually take away anything from our health department if not passed?
I'll go to Dr. Martell to clarify on that.
No, it does not take away any authority that I currently have.
So if I may follow up on that, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Martell, what was the initial, I'm not questioning the health department and its efforts, but what was the initial reasoning as to creating this resolution?
The initial intent was to not have to go complete to a closure immediately if the executive order was not, because under the health authority for the executive order, the tool that I would have is an immediate closure. So we wanted to give that normally, and it's the only establishment, only within Winnebago County are food establishments have that ability under this particularly the executive order for us to then have gone to the hearing process. So we wanted to add this as an interim step rather than I go in and identify that someone is not in compliance, then I go to a closure.
So you're saying with this process, so without this process, no matter what, you're gonna, the health department would go in, but they would not have the possibility of letting whatever said issue was get remedied before going to a closure? Am I
That's correct.
Nothing further for right now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bellick. Any other questions on the amended motion before the board related to the COVID-19 ordinance for the health department? Okay, with that, a yes vote would pass the amended ordinance and no vote would decline the amended ordinance. I will ask the clerk again to please call the roll. Clerk Emma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Gorel. Mrs. Gorel.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Hoffman.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors.
Yes.
Mrs. Red.
Yes.
Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Mr. Schultz.
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni.
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
No.
Mr. Westcott. I will mark Mr. Westcott present. Mr. Zintak.
Yes.
Mr. Arena.
Pass.
Mr. Billich.
No.
Mr. Booker.
No.
Mr. Butita,
No.
Mrs. Crosby,
No.
Mr. Fellers,
Yes.
and Mr. Fiducia is still absent. So that brings me back to Mr. Arena.
No.
And I'm a
Okay,
yes.
Mr. Chairman, that makes it 11 yes, 6 no, 1 present, and 1 absent.
No, you missed me, Lori.
I'm sorry. Mr. Girl?
I'm a yes.
Okay, thank you.
So motion passes. We passed the amended ordinance, the 60-day sunset, and that has now passed the board. So thank you very much for the discussion, and I'm sure this will be coming back in the somewhat near future. Appreciate the questions over the last several minutes here. And with that, one thing I just want to clarify for the record, I texted Mr. Westcott, Clerk Gumau, to confirm his attendance at this meeting. I see his name. I don't see his face. If I get a thumbs up from him or even a text back, I'll confirm he's present for the meeting. If not, he can't be present for a vote if he's not technically present for the meeting. But we'll give him every opportunity to be present for the meeting, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Chairman.
Yep, is that fair?
Just so that our records report that accurately, thank you.
Yes, okay, I just got a text back from Mr. Westcott. I believe he's having a hard time unmuting his thing, but he is at the meeting.
Okay.
He would wish to vote no for that item. So unless there's board objection, I do have a document from I got a documented text from Mr. Westcott. He is a no vote on the vote we just took. Unless there's objection from the board, we'll allow that vote and we will mark Mr. Westcott as present for the meeting. I see no objection to that little maneuver, so we'll go ahead with it. Motion passes. Thank you very much for the discussion. I'll go back to Mr. McDonald for his next item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next resolution is regarding precinct judges. In a nice step, we're ahead of ourselves. The statute says we need to pass this in July. So I don't know if it's okay just to remove this from the agenda or if you'd like us to lay it over till the next meeting, but I would rather not take action on it tonight.
You can go ahead if we can pull it.
Thank you.
You don't need to take any action on that. So we'll pull that and you bring it back. We can just bring it back when you want to bring it back. That's fine.
Yeah, we'll be back for the next meeting.
Okay, got it. Next item is go ahead, Mr. McDonald, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Resolution awarding quotes for bulk natural gas supply, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the resolution awarding quotes for bulk natural gas supply. Second by Mrs. Crosby. Thank you. Item is now before the board. I don't know if somebody wants to speak to this. I do know that this particular type of purchasing process is like a day of or very expedited. The quotes don't stand for very long. And I do know we're saving upwards of $20,000. Appreciate, I know there's multiple people worked on this, but purchasing department in particular. Is there anything you wanted to add, Mr. McDonald or Steve or anybody else? Steve, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We actually did take quotes today. That's through our broker. I believe it's Rock River Energy, who we've worked with in the past. And the particular quote that was received, that's lowest, it's Nicor interchange. It's, I think, 0.2520 per therm. And it would be for a 3-year term. It would actually start April 1st of next year. But you are correct in terms of the savings based on the current usage. It's about a $20,000 savings annually.
3-year term, 20,000 saved per year, 60,000 over the 3-year term. Thank you very much. Any other questions by board members? Okay, I don't see or hear any. So are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? I do not see or hear any objections. So we're going to ask Clerk Gumow to cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. With that, I'll go back to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is a resolution awarding cybersecurity Winnebago County Metropolitan Area Network replacement of obsolete firewalls.
We got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the resolution awarding cybersecurity. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Hoffman. Thank you very much. Item is now before the board for discussion. Any questions or comments by board members on this resolution? Yes, sir. Mr. Schultz, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all saw this is a staggering amount of money. And when I looked at the title of the resolution, it talks about the Metropolitan Area Network, which sounds like it's greater than just our immediate entity. And so my question is whether or not we're going to recover some of this expense because we're providing service to other entities outside of our immediate Winnebago County folks.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to go to either Gus or to Steve, if you would like to jump in on this.
Our metropolitan area network is pretty pervasive. It includes nursing home, it includes public safety building, courthouse, and all the buildings we operate in the county of Winnebago. And there are some Rockford Housing Authority and RPC1. We provide services to them, and they do pay for bandwidth. Will that help recover? Oh, I don't know how that would work. We do bill them for bandwidth, and that's part of why we need firewalls. And plus, these firewalls are end of life, end of support in April, and this past April, and we managed to get them into an insurance policy with a company called SHI. So if they failed, I could have fairly rapid replacement. And these have been on the table in the past and have not made it past budget cycles. If we don't replace these, we're facing trouble. We're dealing with old technology.
Thank you. And just for the record, I see Mr. Schultz has a follow-up. I'll go back to you, Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my plea would be that to the extent that we're able to reasonably go back to any of the entities that have budgets outside of the general fund, that we would make that attempt, and where this is a huge expense again, and where we could go back to those that we're providing service to and say, this is an unusual expense, but it's a large expense, and our rates that we charge don't accommodate huge capital expenditures like this. And so we're making a request that we get some reimbursement. Steve, I'm asking you to strongly consider this and look at our options to try to get reimbursed where we can.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chapman, you had mentioned in committee that you were going to explore possibly a 5-year debt service plan. Have you gotten any further on that? Do you know anything about interest rates?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not at this time. We are looking at the possibility of debt certificates, which range in the neighborhood of about 2 to 2.5% per year. It would be presumably a 5-year installment purchase. So we'll be paying out about 82 grand a year. So we are looking at that option.
Just a follow-up, if I may, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
sir.
Remind me, Mr. Chapman, why did this come through operations and not finance?
Well, I believe the operations committee has overview of the IT department, and that's where we brought it through. Once we get the financing in place, we'll we'll probably take that through the finance committee.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Arena.
Mr. Chapman, if we don't borrow money, what would be the source of funding for this?
Well, it would probably be the general fund, which is not a good source of funding. That's why I suggested doing it through some sort of an installment purchase.
So either way, this is going to be a budget amendment that's going to come through finance.
At some point in time, yes. Once we get the financing, well, not really, because, yeah, I guess it would be because we haven't budgeted the dollars. But once we get the installment purchased on the first year payment would be a budget amendment, which would be covered by the installment purchase from the financial institution that we end up going with.
I guess I'm curious. It sounds from what Mr. Gettner has said that it was known when we put together our last budget that this expenditure would be needed, that it was inevitable. Am I missing something? I guess I don't understand why it wasn't accounted for in our last budget, or was it just removed thinking that we would be able to limp along for a while, or how did we come to this spot now?
I would just say this, and then I'll turn to Steve for specifics. Limping along is probably the right analysis to how we've approached budgeting for IT. And we got to the point we can't limp along anymore. Steve, is there anything you want to add?
Well, no, I think from my understanding, I wasn't here, but there was a capital plan that was put together back in March of, I think, 2019. And I think it was rather ambitious. I don't know how much total dollars, 25 million, somewhere in that. And at that time, the finance committee determined that they wanted to continue to look at that. And as far as the budget process, that, the capital plan was not included in the budget. We were just trying to get the budget balance just based on the day-to-day expenses.
Any follow-up, Mr. Arena?
No, thank you. Thank you for answering my question.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments by board members on this item? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Just for the record, I do not hear or see any negative responses. So I'm going to ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're finally on to our last item for this evening, which is a resolution amending the organizational structure of the county board of the county of Winnebago, Illinois. And I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. McDonald to amend the structure of the county board. Second by Mrs. Crosby. Let's, if we could, Mr. McDonald, since the description is rather vague, how were we amending the organizational structure, just for the record?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. After Mr. Boomer had left, there were vacancies there. I had Mr. Arena and Mr. Butita reach out to me and express interest in maybe moving around to fill some of those vacancies, and that's what we did. So I've got the agenda up and not the exact. Mr. Butita moved off of economic development and onto finance, and we did not fill that position on economic development. Mr. Arena moved to personnel and policies and off of public safety, which left with Mr. Zintek to go to public safety and public works. Did I say that right, Paul?
No. So Mr. Butita is staying on economic development, and I'm leaving, and I'm staying on public safety, and Mr. Butita is leaving, and Mr. Zintak's replacing Butita there. So Zintak is on public safety and public works, and I'm going to personnel and policy from economic development, and Butita is going to finance from Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Reno. I did not have that printed out. I appreciate that.
Mr. Reno, what's your second committee besides personnel policy? My apologies.
Operations, and then, so I'm on 3 now, and I would be on 3 again. I would be on Personnel Policy, Public Safety, and Operations.
Got it. And Mr. Butita, your second committee is Economic Development along with Finance, if this motion is passed. Is that correct, Mr. Butita?
In addition to operations also.
Okay.
So I would be on 3 committees.
Got it. Okay, so the motion then includes Butita, Mr. Butita would be on Finance, Economic Development, and Operations. Mr. Reno would be a Personnel Policy Committee, Operations Committee, Public Safety Committee. Mr. Zintak would be on Public Safety Committee and Public Works. Is that correct for the record? That's how we're amending the structure. That is before the board. Any discussion on this, these committee-related assignments? I do not see or hear any other comments. So with that, are there any board members who are opposed to the motion? I do not see or hear any opposition to this motion, so I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald.
That finally concludes the report. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Public Works Committee has 1 resolution and 1 ordinance this evening. Our first item is Resolution 20-022, and it's a resolution authorizing the execution of a preliminary engineering services agreement with Chastain and Associates LLC, and it's for the purpose of completing contract plans for a box culvert replacement on Yale Bridge Road over Sugar Creek. It's a $44,800 cost to the county, and I would so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Tassoni on 20-022, the preliminary engineering services agreement related to the box culvert replacement. May I have a second, please? Second, thank you, Mr. Webster. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this resolution? Seeing and hearing no opposition, I'm going to ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Clerk Gamow. Or I'm sorry, Mr. Tassoni.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is an ordinance. It's ordinance 20-023, and it's an ordinance prohibiting parking on Old River Road between Carlson Court and Wake Forest Parkway, and that is to be laid over.
We've read that in now. Thank you very much.
And that is all we have on our report, and we expect our next Public Works meeting to be held in person.
Okay, that ordinance will lay over to the next board meeting. Thank you for your update, and we'll go on to the Public Safety Committee. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 1 resolution tonight, and that is an extension, a resolution to extend the contract of the Sheriff's Department with McChesney Park, extended to July 30th of 2020. There was a typo discovered in committee tonight, and the typo involves it was on the agenda as June 30th, and it was amended to July 30th. So it's a resolution to extend the McChesney Park contract with the Sheriff's Department to July 30th of 2020.
We have a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution extending the IGA for police services with the Village of McChesney Park. It is correct on the board agenda. It was probably incorrect on the actual item in committee, but it is to July 31st. The second now has been given by Mrs. Crosby. So this resolution is before the board. The only question I have is this is like our 3rd time extending. Do we think there'll be a 4th extension? Do we think we'll get it wrapped up in the next 30 days? The second question is what's causing the holdup?
Mr. Chapman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chapman did advise that things are finally wrapping up, and we will have a signed agreement before the end of the month. And I'm assuming that the holdup was probably the loss of the village administrator up there. I could be wrong, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong. Is there anyone else that would like to add anything to that?
So just logistics on their side, perhaps, not a deal breaker or anything like that. Okay. Any other comments? I see a hand up, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification purposes, the error that was in the public safety packet is also in the board packet. And so what we're voting on is the amended version that came out of committee. There's in the paragraph before the last in the resolution, in the last sentence, it says June 30th, and it should say July 31st. And that was approved in committee, just for the record. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arena. Any other comments or questions on the extension that will run through July 30th, 2020? Seeing none, are there any board members opposed to this extension? I see none and hear no objection, so I'll ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wondering if Deputy Chief Mark Carner is still online.
I'm here.
Thank you, Chief. Thanks for joining us tonight. I do have a serious public safety issue, and that is the illegal behavior of individuals laying in the street, stopping traffic. This is a very serious situation, potentially interfering with could be a woman in labor, it could be a heart attack, or a parent rushing their child to the hospital after swallowing poison, or it could simply be an officer responding to a violent domestic. Is there any coordination with the city chief on a resolution of this? Because this just cannot be allowed to happen. It's not an opinion. It is a violation of the law, and it is a very serious safety issue that the only results that could come of this would be tragic results. Mr. Chief Carter.
Yes, there's been regular communication between our office from the sheriff and other members of the command staff and the city police department administration. We work very well together, very closely, and this has been a very closely coordinated effort responding to the various protests that have occurred in recent days.
Right. Yeah, I understand protesting, and that's not an issue at all. But it is a definite public safety issue. It's careless. The people aren't thinking about the other citizens that could potentially be in an emergency. So thank you for that update, Chief. And that's all I have for public safety.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Our next item of business is the Personnel Policy Committee. Mr. Fiducia is not with us, I do not believe. Could we get an update since it's under the...
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry?
I'd like to ask Mr. Booker a question, please.
Sure.
Going back to the Public Safety Committee, I can't hear whoever is talking. Is that Mrs. Red?
Yes, it is.
Okay, Mrs. Red, you have the floor. We're going to back up away from personnel policy, back to public safety. Mrs. Red has the floor and has a question.
I believe it was in this committee. It was mentioned that we would do a public forum. Mr. Booker, can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, ma'am. I did bring it up. We attempted to have a Republican caucus on Monday night, Tuesday night, Monday or Tuesday, but we weren't able to obtain a quorum. So I did mention it to the guys there that issue was raised by you, and we need to move forward with that. Again, unfortunately, we were unable to obtain a quorum to get that discussion on record.
Now, can that be brought up?
Sure. Yeah, it can be brought up whereas Mrs. Red has raised, well, it was brought up in the last meeting, I believe, and
We had a motion and a second for the public forum. So what else do we need to do?
Mr.
Yeah, I
Fallon.
think there's some confusion on the floor. So what happened at the last meeting, I think Mrs. Red made a motion, it was seconded, and there was committee support for asking the sheriff to host a public forum in the near future as a standalone public forum. That was it was a motion. It was not a resolution or an ordinance. It was a discussion that turned into a motion from the floor of the committee. It was not on the agenda. It was not an official resolution that was passed that would come to the board, but it was a discussion, and it was a motion that received majority support in committee. That was actually what occurred in the Public Safety Committee. Is that an accurate reflection, Mr. Booker and Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Yes, so that needs to be in the form of, what else do we need to do with that?
The sheriff, the sheriff is aware of the request that came from the Public Safety Committee discussion and motion. And Mr. Saganek attended that particular committee meeting. And so the request, which was an ask of that committee to the sheriff, that he is aware of that request.
So it looks like it just requires a little follow-up here, and I can get that done tomorrow.
Will you contact me, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion on that item or any other public safety item? Okay, then we'll move on to personnel and policy. I do not believe we have Mr. Fiducia with us tonight, but we did have some discussion around the county administrator search. Could somebody on the committee or the ad hoc committee provide whatever is an appropriate update on this week, the activities of this week? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on Monday, we did conducted a meet and greet with the first candidate of department heads and county board members who were not part of the ad hoc committee and the county electeds. On Tuesday, we interviewed that candidate. Today, there was another meet and greet for the third candidate. The second candidate had withdrawn. And then tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., we will interview the third candidate. And after that, we'll discuss the two, and then we'll have to schedule an ad hoc committee meeting for next week to just formalize our recommendation to personnel and policy on which of the two candidates we would like to make a conditional offer to. Should it happen that neither candidate is considered to be acceptable, then Workplace said they would reissue the posting and solicit more applications.
Do you feel at this point that there is going to be coalescence around a particular candidate and discussions of an offer?
Well, I've only met one so far, so I really would be uncomfortable answering that question until I meet the third candidate. I mean, his resume looks attractive, or I haven't actually seen his resume, but the profile that we were given, all of us had seen it. So I think he has potential. The gentleman we already interviewed was impressive as well. I think it's just, I don't want to make assumptions about what the will of the committee will be.
Got it. So just so we're clear, the process that you passed in the form of a resolution at the last meeting would include the interview tomorrow, and then discussion by the ad hoc committee, some coalescence around a particular candidate. You'd take your recommendation formally to the personnel and policy committee, and then you would begin negotiations and then bring the final approved thing to the county board, or does it go to the county board to get approval to then contact the individual? And I know you talked about this. I apologize, I'm being redundant.
Yeah, no, it'll go to the county board for approval of a conditional offer to one of the candidates. And the reason it's a conditional offer is because of Illinois law, there's certain aspects of the vetting process that they cannot perform until an offer is made, for like criminal background screening. No one expects these candidates to fail on that, but it's for that reason that it's considered a conditional offer. The other thing that could go off track is if we can't reach an agreement on terms of a contract with whoever we select. So personnel policy, then to the full board, then workplace, along with Mr. Chapman, will seek to negotiate a contract with the selected individual.
Since one candidate withdrew and we're at 2, I would just throw this out as an offer or something to think about, is if you or the group or anybody thinks that a special board meeting is needed to expedite discussions to keep things moving so we don't have to wait 2 weeks, just yell. But if not, that's fine too. Any other questions regarding this process? Okay, I see none, and so we can move on to the next item. Any unfinished business by board members? Any under new business, we do have Otter Creek Lake Utility District Board, which is in Lake Somerset. There is the reappointment of Fred Kyle. It is a 3-member board. It is specific to the utility district in Lake Somerset, and that would run May 2020 through May 2025, and that is to be read in tonight to lay over. Yes, sir, Mr. Webster.
Yeah, I'd like to move to suspend on that. That's something particular to that private community there. If that's their choice, I have no problem with it. It's in my district, by the way.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster to suspend the rules then, which then separately would allow us to vote this evening. A second by Mr. Billick, Mr. Gurl, and Mr. Kelly. So the motion is to suspend the rules. A yes vote would allow us to suspend the rules, which then in a separate action, we would vote up or down on Mr. Kyle. Any discussion about whether or not to suspend the rules? Any questions? Seeing none, are there any board members opposed to Mr. Webster's motion to suspend? Seeing none and hearing none, we will ask Clerk Gumout to cast a yes vote. For all members present, we've now suspended the rules, and which would allow us to vote this evening. And with that, I would entertain a motion to approve Fred Kyle to the Otter Creek Lake Utility District Board in Lake Somerset. A motion by Mr. Webster. Could somebody second that? Mr. Gurl, thank you. And Mr. Hoffman is the second. So with that, any discussion on the reappointment of Fred Kyle to this particular board? Seeing none, are there any board members opposed to the motion? Seeing none, we will ask Clerk Gumout to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much. We've reappointed Mr. Kyle, and thank you for the vote on that. And any other new business being brought forward by board members? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion by Mr. Webster, second by Mr. Billick. Any opposed to adjournment? Seeing none, we've adjourned. Thank you very much. Have a great night, everybody.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great one. Thank you.